One of the most frequent questions that I see from individual contributors or ICs is, what exactly does a manager do? The answer they usually come up with is, well, they're not talking to me, they're not coding, so nothing. The actual answer is quite a bit more interesting. Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I spent the last 30 years working in industry as a software engineer and as a software engineering manager. I spent 15 of those years as a principal engineer and 13 of them as a manager. I worked at companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so on. When I was managing, I managed anywhere from 2 to 25 people. So I've seen a range of different types of management environments. A complaint I hear frequently is, my manager never does anything. This is usually from somebody who's frustrated, overworked, or both. In a perfect world, a person's manager would act like a very visible guardian angel, constantly looking out for the best interests of their employee, making sure they get promoted quickly and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, we live in the real world, where managers are far too busy to be able to take on this role. So what exactly is it that managers are doing that keeps them so busy? Software engineering managers have 3 levels of responsibilities, just like senior individual contributors. These are working within their team and making sure that things move smoothly, working with their peers underneath their manager, who we'll call a director to keep it simpler, and doing the sorts of things that you have to do for your manager, and then taking care of company-wide requirements and initiatives. For any of the companies that I've worked at as a manager, any 2 of these 3 categories will be more than enough to keep the manager busy all day long. Instead of letting any of these starve, a good manager will pick things that they can get done in each of the categories and kind of balance their attention around. Firefighting is a common strategy to deal with this sort of overwork that a manager has. What they'll do at any given time is take a look and see what's the most on fire and needs the most attention. That gets immediate attention, and they have a whole list of how much on fire things are. Anything that's not on fire often winds up on the bottom of this list. For example, a competent, well-performing employee that isn't complaining. Even if that's something that's going to blow up in the manager's face in 6 months, that's really a problem for 6 months from now. And even though it isn't terribly fair, the employee won't get a whole lot of attention from the manager. A more typical place a manager will wind up spending time, at least within their team, is on the employees who are flaming out and are in danger of completely exploding. That can take up almost all of the time that a manager has available for their own team. Managing the team directly involves a lot of different things from the manager. They have to make sure that it's clear to each of the employees what they should be accomplishing and that they're getting at least some feedback that, yes, that really needs to get done. They need to be given the resources and the space and the time to be able to accomplish whatever their goals are. It also includes defining and enforcing all of the processes for the team, making sure that people are compliant with whatever the requirements are for code hygiene, for security, for information security, documentation, all these sorts of things. There's also making sure that there's overlap in what people know in the group so that any single person being unexpectedly taken out doesn't cause problems. Making sure that there's people available to respond to questions, ensuring the right aliases exist, putting together an on-call rotation for handling issues that come up, making sure that any live services are still running correctly, making sure everybody takes whatever training they're required to do, and that they file for the appropriate IP protection, whether that's simply classifying the information or marking it as a trade secret or filing patents for it. They also need to make sure that the team is playing nicely with the other people they have to work with, whether it's within the team or in peer teams. And whenever there's a problem that comes up from that, the manager has to make sure that those get resolved and that people can continue moving forward. And of course, the manager is ultimately measured on what their team produces, so they have a lot of incentive to try and make sure the team is productive as possible. That doesn't necessarily mean that the employees are happy, but rather that in a given semester, they produce a good amount of output that is expected from the team. I mentioned providing resources to the team. The manager is ultimately responsible for making sure that everybody has the machines they need to do their work. If they need cloud accounts, if they need any sort of shared resources at the company, the manager decides how much there is, makes budgets, gets those budgets approved, and then gives the equipment or the access to the right people in the team. The manager has to make sure that the members of the team are working well together. This includes making sure that each person understands what their role in the team is and that they have some awareness of the work other people are doing. This is one of the main reasons that teams have status meetings that everybody goes to rather than just sending some information to the manager. It helps people understand what each other are doing, and it helps promote more cohesion within the team. Hiring new employees and transitioning existing employees out of the team also takes a lot of effort for the manager. For a team that's growing and busy, it can be up to half of that manager's time, sometimes more than that. They're responsible for coming up with an estimate of how many people they need, getting approval for that head count, coming up with job descriptions, working with HR to get a pipeline of candidates incoming, and then doing the initial evaluation of those candidates to see who is worth talking to. Once they have that, they'll still have to do technical screens of the people who are worth talking to, or dedicate one of their senior resources to help out with those technical screens. Candidates who look worth interviewing, they also have to decide who they can afford to put into an interview loop from their own team and borrow people from other teams as well. Put together a 1 or 2 day interview loop, meet up with the person for lunch or for dinner, and then follow up afterwards and make sure that regardless of whether the person's hired or not hired, they leave with a good impression of the recruiting process. The manager's work isn't done after that person gets an offer. Then they have to worry about when the person's going to come aboard, what sort of things they're going to work on. They have to come up with an onboarding plan. Often this is an adaptation of some of the documentation that exists for the team for people starting up, or they have to get that documentation created. They need to ensure that the employee is happy with things, meet them when they first come, probably take them out to lunch on their first day at work, and work closely with them for at least a few days. They also need to find somebody who can act as a mentor for that employee for the longer term. The mentor would typically be someone who is relatively junior in the team, so that they're familiar with all of the onboarding processes, having just done them. Even when they've identified a mentor, the manager still needs to follow up and make sure that the mentor is actually meeting with the new employee and that the relationship is going well enough that they can back away and treat the new employee more as they would any of their other employees. This usually takes anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months. I named a bunch of stuff here. It's not everything that a manager does related to their team that they're managing, but it's a healthy amount of it. What does a manager do working for their own manager? Again, to make things a little more clear, we'll call the manager's manager a director instead. So what all does the manager have to do on the director's team? Just like the manager, the director has responsibilities for their immediate team. They need to make sure that people are aware of the work that each other's doing, that there's coverage in case somebody needs to leave. They need to onboard people, do hiring, all these sorts of things. So all the things that I just named for the manager's team, figure that the director probably needs to do analogous things for their direct reports, who are all managers. What this means is a lot of the overhead that the individual contributors working for the manager have, the manager also has for their director. So they have to go to status meetings. They need to provide plans of what they're doing and give updates on it. They have one-on-ones with the manager. They'll also have additional meetings just having to do with the fact that they're managing instead of being an IC. In addition to these weekly status meetings and so on with the director, a manager will typically have to attend what are called war team meetings, which look at the overall health of the product. The war team meetings typically are taking a look at the quality of the product and progress towards the next milestone for the release of the product. In addition to this, the manager will also typically have to worry about support of the product. If they are working on some sort of a service, an internet service that's deployed, they have to make sure that any issues that arise in that service get taken care of, they get looked at. This is usually called a live site meeting, and it's typically a much larger meeting than just the immediate team of that manager. All these meetings that the manager attends, they don't just take time for the meeting. For things like the live site meetings and the meetings about progress towards things and war team meetings, they can require several hours of preparation before the meeting, and then they can require anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple days of follow-up by the manager to make sure that the issues that came up and the things that they said they would do actually happen. In addition to the sets of things that an individual contributor would typically see as overhead for their team, the director has other types of meetings as well. For example, they'll regularly have offsites to try and do strategic planning for what the teams underneath the director are going to do in the future. The manager has to prepare for these, come up with a description of what they're doing right now, how things are going, and what their plan is for the next 6 months or year or 2 years or even 3 years. If the director prefers to see presentations, the manager is going to have to put together a fairly polished slide deck with diagrams and explanations and supporting evidence for what they're proposing. So all of this takes a lot of work. The manager is also a conduit between the director and upwards and the manager's own team. So what they'll do is whenever something's going really well, They will make sure that the employee's name gets mentioned to the director and to the director's other managers so that everybody's familiar with great work somebody's doing. This is just good practice so that people get recognized for what they're doing, and it also helps lay the groundwork for being able to justify promotions or special rewards for people as the year goes on. You want the peers of your manager and the director and maybe even the people above the director to know the name of somebody who's doing a good job. The manager also works with the director to understand things that are coming down the pipe that might affect their team. This can include reorgs or having to move to a different location, people being shuffled around, all kinds of things like this. You hear about these things occasionally as an individual contributor, usually with reassurance that, oh no, this won't affect you at all. But the fact is, it's brought up and considered much more often than you ever hear about as an individual contributor. So one of the things that a manager has to do is to represent the interests of their team in these discussions and then decide when things are serious enough that it's worth bringing it down and mentioning it to their team. What I've seen as a manager is that there's usually between 3 and 5 times as much happening in terms of reorgs and people getting shuffled around and so on that are considered than actually happen. If you heard all those things as an IC, you'd probably just be paralyzed by the distraction. Your manager helps insulate you from this and keep you from having to worry about it. Many companies have a semi-annual or an annual planning process called, for example at Amazon, it's called OLR. This is where people come up with the set of objectives and priorities for the team, not just for the manager's team, often not just for the director's team, but for the organization, what they're going to focus on moving forward. For example, they might say, over the next year, we really want to grow this ability of our team, or we really need to double down and focus on security, or robustness of a code, or scalability, whatever it happens to be. And then all the work that needs to be done to keep the light on has to be justified in terms of that. As well, any new work that is being proposed to be done in a given area has to be justified and ranked in terms of importance by those criteria. This process takes an incredible amount of time and effort. A manager can spend anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months for each of these planning cycles. Planning, proposing, revising, replanning, reproposing, giving feedback on everybody else's plans, getting buy-in from other teams to deliver things that are going to be needed, and making commitments for their team to deliver things that are going to be required by the other teams. This is a big part of what a manager does. Earlier I mentioned one-on-ones and reviews as things that a manager does for their team, but the fact is there's a lot more work that goes into reviews than just what's mentioned to the individual contributors. The manager has budgets for how much reward they can give to somebody and how many people can be promoted in a given review cycle. That means that they have to discuss who's going to get that budget with their peers and with their director. By default, there's a certain amount of budget set aside for each team, but this can be a little flexible if somebody says, no, my team really did great. I've almost never heard anybody say, my team doesn't deserve their budget. So it's always a discussion about the great things people are doing and getting people on board with saying, yes, that person really does deserve budget, even though they don't necessarily have it right now. Reviews for the team takes a lot more than what you see just out of the manager writing a review for you. And in fact, them representing you further up often is done without your review being completed yet. They have information about what you've been doing and they propose moving you forward in the company based on that information. And then they go back and write your review after you have submitted it to them based on what they know about the rewards and so on. From time to time, a director will need to take on a new project. This is typically done by choosing one of their existing managers and getting them to do investigation and come up with estimates for that project. Is it feasible? Is it a reasonable project? How many people will be needed for it for how long? All of this planning and investigation takes a fair amount of time for the manager to put together. And then it's usually reviewed by the director and by people above the director. And the manager has to do a good job of this, provide reasonable presentation materials for it, and be able to justify any of the assertions they're making in it. In addition to this, the manager also has to make sure that all their existing commitments are getting met, or they have to figure out which commitments to drop so that they can borrow some people to spin up this new project. They also need to justify how many people they need when to be able to move the project forward, what they can provide as a minimum viable product, and when they can actually ship the thing. It's a ton of work. So anytime you see your manager pick up a new project, realize there's a lot of investigation and a lot of specification that goes into it before you ever hear about it. The third category of work that a manager does is company-wide requirements that they meet. For example, there will be annual training that everybody in the company or everybody in a given role needs to take. The manager is the one who follows up on that and nags people and makes sure they set aside time for the training. If there's budget for training people in addition to that, they also make sure that that gets prioritized and spent by their team. They're responsible for making sure that the team is following all of the requirements that the company has. For example, information classification security and general security, cryptographic requirements, things like this. These are all things the manager has to enforce on their team. If they're lucky, their team's already aware of these things and doing them, but the manager still has to check. And if the team isn't following up on it, then the manager is still on the hook for it and has to figure out how that's going to get done for the team. In summary, your manager is responsible for a lot of work that you never see. So when they're in their office with the door closed, tippity typing away, they're not just playing games or sending emails to their friends. They are actually doing work, most likely. Just to get the two of the three categories covered that a manager will typically work on is already more than a full-time job at every place I've been. And figuring out what can drop on the floor and keeping your people happy and making sure that your team grows as it needs to, it's all a huge burden. So this is what a manager does with their time. If you've ever wondered why your manager doesn't check in important code, well, that's because they can't really afford to. At any time, something can catch on fire and the manager has to drop what they're doing and go take care of that. Earlier in my career, I took on important, interesting code because I felt I was the best person to do it. And then I promptly wound up getting delayed on implementing it by a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And this had a ripple effect on my team where they were blocked by this work not being done. After being stung by this once or twice, I didn't do it again. So an implication of this for me is if you have a manager who spends a lot of their time doing coding, you should be skeptical that they're doing all these other things I talked about in this video because there's only so much time in the day. More typically, a manager, if they want to keep their hands in the code at any capacity, will pick small, optional, trivial things to implement. Maybe bug fixes, maybe a value-added feature that doesn't have to be there and doesn't have to be robust for the product to ship. That's because, just like everybody else, lots of managers love designing and love coding, and they miss it when they don't get to do it. Have you ever been a manager or a manager of managers? How does the information that I presented here sit with you? Does it seem reasonable to you? Are you skeptical? I'd love to hear your opinions down below in the comments, and I'll chime in wherever I can. Thank you for watching the video, and keep on pushing forward. Hi, this is John. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing so you get notified of my future videos. Also, if you are interested, you might want to check out the video I have linked here. Thanks, and keep on pushing forward.